Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sarah Roven. I am a lead educator here at Pearlstone, and I want to welcome all of you to Pearlstone's Shavuot Sojourn, a Jewish agricultural journey, an entire week dedicated to ancient grains, farming, and Jewish wisdom. Before we begin, I ask that everyone make sure they're muted. And I also invite everyone to turn on their cameras. So we want to create a little online community here. So if you feel comfortable, I invite you to turn on your camera. If you have any questions or wish to join the conversation at any point during this session, please drop your questions in the chat and we will be sure to call on you. Or read your question aloud to our presenters. So today we will be learning about the founding of the Jewish Farmer Network with Shani, Mink, and Sarah Seldin. Shani's desire to share the depth and beauty of the connection between farming and Judaism brought her to where she is today. And Sarah is a first-generation farmer who, besides co-founding the Jewish Farmer Network, is a steward in residence of the Yesod Farm and Kitchen in Western North Carolina. This conversation will be with Rabbi Psachia Lichtenstein, who is the Director of Education at Pearlstone. Psachia, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah, who's co-hosting, and thank you, Clara, who's watching the room, and thank you, everyone who's going to share in the conversation. We had a pre-conversation that was getting really fun, and then we said it was going Facebook Live, and as turned out that Facebook changes the tone. So hopefully we could keep the tone going despite Facebook Live. So I just want to say we have at least three audiences here. We have the people in the room, the people that registered for this talk. We have Facebook Live, and Clara is going to be sending questions in from that space as they come in, or if they come in. And then we have the people that are watching this. So I just want to make sure that when we use language that is only pertains to a certain community, that we try to translate it, either farming or Hebrew. Both can be a different language. So I think this is going to be so looking forward to this talk. It's so good to see both of you. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about, not just about the Jewish Farmer Network, but why someone is called to Jewish farming, especially in relationship to the network. But why would somebody work so hard for their food? So I wanted to know if one of you or both of you could answer that. Why would you work so hard for your food?
I think that there's a spiritual and oftentimes a nutritional difference between the food that we are able to grow for ourselves or in community and the food that is available and affordable for us to purchase elsewhere. I feel much more connected to the food that I eat when I have had a hand in growing it, or when I know people who have helped grow it. I also had an eating disorder in high school, and my process of growing food has helped me heal some of the patterns of thinking that made it hard to connect with my food, and to feel to allow me to integrate my body and with the food that I'm eating by having a hand in putting energy into the soil and having that energy then feed me, and being part of that circle with the creating of the spending of calories and the creating of calories.
Well, yeah, so I've been thinking a lot recently about the ways that, in order for a community to have sovereignty and to be, to feel safe and sustained is being in control of one's own food system. So that's moving right now a lot of communities of color towards growing their own food, and also for ourselves. So having that safety and security kind of in our own hands, because as we've seen, especially in light of coronavirus, that it's a really scary place to be at the whim of a globalized food system that is not always dependable, and that there can be breaks in that chain. And if there's breaks in that chain, our own personal food and sustenance is like not guaranteed. And to have a hand in that is like to like build security for ourselves and our communities, like locally and cultural communities. And also that it is like a really nourishing act. I come to farming from like a really basic place of like, I like to use my body in like really like hard physical ways. Like I can't do mental work until I've done physical work. And like, that's just something that like feels good in my body. And like the food, like Sarah was saying, is just so much sweeter that way. And also like nutritional density. I saw this crazy graphic the other day that like spinach from like 100 years ago is like more nutritionally dense than like if you took like a pound of spinach from 100 years ago, it would take like, I think it was like 30 pounds of spinach to like have the same nutrient density that kind of than that spinach had. And like, it's just like a really interesting thing. And that has a lot to do with like soils and the ways that our soils are feeding the food that is then feeding us. And then we have to be feeding the soil properly in order to get that nutrition. And a lot of like the calories that people are consuming right now are like actually super empty. And this actually I could take this really far, but I'm going to let it be a different question. So go on.
Yeah, we'll get there. But if I'm correct, did you both move towards being Jewish farmers before the idea of the Jewish Farmer Network and Yisod Farm and Kitchen? Great name. We should talk about that. Great name. But before those ideas grew, before that journey, you already were dedicated to that work, both of you, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I've been working on farms since I was 18, so it's been about 8 years. And now, you know, I'll know how old I am, but
I don't know, but I guess
we can do math, but I've been working on farms since I was 18. And for me, that was like, it was a very separate thing for my Judaism for the first like 3 years of it. And it was just like, I enjoy doing this thing that is like both like dynamic and embodied. And then like the Jewish part kind of came in later and like deepened the experience. So the farming, the desire for hard work predated the Jewish Farmer Network work.
And for me, I started farming about 5 years ago at a community garden 8 minutes from where we are now, near Asheville, North Carolina. And like through the process of growing food in the community setting, realized like, oh, I come from a 5,000-year-old agricultural tradition. And like the things that I'm doing, I have language for my own tradition to honor the cycles that I'm engaged with and to celebrate the harvest and to clean my body after like a hard week's of work. Like all of these things have precedent and like a poetic language that I have access to that's part of my own lineage. And I think part of founding the network with Shani came from a desire to learn more about that intersection of where Judaism and agriculture meet, and how a modern farmer, whether they're coming to it with that awareness of the connections or not, can engage with like the incredible interplay between our tradition and our vocations.
And so how you two are like it's funny talking to two people in one box instead of two people in two different boxes. So how you guys are like a powerhouse together. How did that come about?
So Sarah and I met at the Hazon Food Conference, and it's really annoying to say when we met because it was on December 31st of 2016. So if I say like winter 2016, it's like kind of 2017 also. But so that was the last Hazon Food Conference that happened in the winter time. The next one was in the summer. So that also means that was the last Hazon Food Conference that farmers could attend, because farmers are busy in the summer. And so the winter time is the only time that we can actually gather for any sort of conferences or community. So that was the last Hazon Food Conference that was in the winter. Sarah called for like an impromptu circling up of anyone there who identified as a Jewish farmer, and we sat around in the synagogue there and just like talked about it. And it's an interesting place because at Isabella Friedman with the Adamah program, like the connection between Judaism and agriculture is like kind of like in the water. People who come there come for that connection, but there were actually some folks that were just farmers who happened to be Jewish that were there, that were looking for something. And we got to understand that, like, you know, so I mean, I had started my farming journey outside of the Jewish world, but a lot of Jewish farmers are starting from within, you know, Isabella Friedman and going outwards, but there are a lot of people like me who are just like secular, like Jewish farmers. And I'm not saying like that, sorry, secular farmers, like they're farming secularly. And what came out of that conversation is that people who don't come through what I was then calling the Adamah Teva pipeline don't have any context for understanding the connection between Judaism and agriculture. They have no way of connecting with other Jewish farmers. And there was like this like great need for a community initiative and opportunities for community building amongst Jewish farmers that are not just Adamah alumni. Just kind of,
or educators, right? Because
educators, yep.
In my mind, that's the difference. It's like whether most of these modes are purely for education, or is this for farming and Jewish, and it's a synthesis of both. And I mean, the joke that I always say is when I was 20, a friend of mine asked me what I wanted to do, and I said I wanted to be a teacher, and he said, "I know you're Jewish. I was asking you what else you want to do." So, so obviously there's like an educational component to everything people do, but those pipelines are a lot to do with as an educator. So the value is on educator. In one of our other sessions, we were talking to Migrash Farm. And so his model is definitely building community, and education is woven into that. But he wants it to be farming, like it's farming and milling, and he wants that aspect. So the Jewish Farmer Network for me is not just about like Jewish farming as education, but specifically for Jewish farmers, right?
Yep, it's for people who are actually like it's like a kind of like a bigger circle. So I sometimes think of it as like the Jaffe world does a lot of like Jewish outdoors food farming and environmental education, mostly focused on families and children, and that folks aren't doing Jaffe education for actual Jewish farmers. So people who are out there in the world feeling like, hey, I'm the only Jewish farmer in the world. Like in my county, when I'm in farming spaces, I'm the only Jew I know. When I'm in Jewish spaces, I'm the only farmer there. And then like being able to like give them the context for understanding the ways that our vocation and our tradition are connected. So that's like, it is like an educational component, but it's also, so it's just like, funneling that education that, like I was talking about Isabella Friedman, that's like alive in the water there at Isabella Friedman, and making it more widely accessible to folks that are engaged in work with the land.
Josh is asking, how do you find these farmers who aren't already connected?
It's mostly through word of mouth. Shani also went on a massive tour of farm conferences this past winter time, and before we had our first conference, which was at the Pearlstone Center in February. But a lot of times we'll talk to farmers and they'll say like, oh, like I know this person and they are Jewish in farming. Or we'll talk to a Jewish person, they'll say, oh, like I know someone who is Jewish in farming. And I would say the majority of people hear about us through one of those ways, or we hear about them through somebody else.
Definitely at those conferences, I look at people's name tags, and if I see a Cohen or a Goldberg, I talk to them.
Stern is asking, he's curious about farmer as an identity. What does that mean, and who is a farmer? I'd like to add also to that question, because in one of the previous sessions with Khadija, we were talking about layering of identities, about how in this space she's finding lots of layered identities. And I guess one of them is like the layering, both farmer and Jewish, and also what does that even mean? What is that identity, a farmer?
I talk about us like being a pretty big tent when it comes to defining who a farmer is. And part of that comes from an acknowledgement that if we were to narrow the definition of who a farmer is by who owns their own land, that cuts out a majority, particularly young and beginning farmers, where land access is one of the biggest barriers for a young and beginning farmer. If we talk about farmers as just people who are engaged as farming for their full-time job, that again cuts out a huge swath of people who cannot afford to farm without having off-farm income to support their farming. So for us, we're really talking about like trying to center the needs and the perspectives of people who are deeply engaged in agriculture as their parnasa, as their livelihood, but looking at kind of aspiring current and lapsed farmers, with that acknowledgement that people move in and out of agricultural work as their lives allow them to, as situations change. So we're talking about people who are engaged in earth-based work, in stewardship and the growing and tending of food and land, with like a lot of give on the edges for people who are in any point of that process. Mm-hmm. Someone who is gardening today may have been working a production farm 2 years ago and may be on a production farm again in another 3 or 4 years. And we're not going to judge them or exclude them from being part of the conversation just because they're not currently working at a certain scale.
So beekeepers, homesteaders, gardeners, anyone who wants to be part of it from that space is welcome. And definitely farm-based educators too.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know how you would even exclude them if you wanted to, but
they find their way in.
Have you found that, let me, the best way to put it, there's a story that Jews tell that, I don't believe the story, but there's a story that like Jews are not connected to the land. There was, money lenders and business people, and we've been separated from the land for thousands of years, or that kind of story. It would not be nice if you could debunk that, but even without going there, let's just assume it was debunked already. The Jewish farmers is it a similar motivation to be a farmer as out of like an ideal and a love that it was discovered? In other words, like there's farmers, like both of you told the story, and I would tell the story. I would say that I would have the same story for myself, which is like I discovered it and I fell in love with it. And then there's thousands of farmers that was not something they discovered or fell in love with. It's something that they were born into and grew up in, and it permeated their whole lives. So in the farmer network, did you find most farmers are coming from that same, like an idealistic love affair with farming, which is good? It's not a critique, like, or have you found people that were born into it?
So it's a mix. It's mostly the idealistic love of the work folks, and this has a lot to do with the perceptions about Jews and agriculture and land. So a lot of folks in our network, they've been asking us, they're like, we want more elders in our community, more mentors. And there actually aren't that many Jewish farmers in the generation above us, because Jews have been told repeatedly for a couple of generations now that physical labor is not something that Jews do, that Jews are not farmers. And so we have, the generation above us, there aren't that many. And so there's a big idealistic love affair with land moving through our generation generally. And I say that, young Jews are not immune. We are, so there's, a lot of people are coming to it from like an ideals standpoint.
I would say two things. One, that it's the idealism balanced with the heartbreak, that I think we see people cycling through like a love of farming combined with like having their heart broken by farming, and some people come back and some people don't. And I think like networks like ours and others that provide communities of practice and provide peers and mentors kind of soften the blows of the heartbreak and allow people to kind of stay engaged with that love through the lived realities of how difficult it is to farm, how hard it is economically, how hard it is on our bodies. And the other thing is that kind of this complicated relationship with land and with farming is really old in the Jewish story. Jewish Farmer Network is running along with Alex Voy now, a Jews and Land study group that just concluded our first run of it, of 2 sold out sessions, and it explored this relationship between Jews and land. And one of the things that I learned recently through that class is that in the Babylonian exile, it was the elites of what we now call Jews, but at that point we weren't Jews yet, the elites who were exiled from the land, and that the farmers were not exiled in the same way, we're not left behind. And then in our exile, the people who were like part of the people oftentimes had to choose between like their land-based pursuits and continuing to be part of the people, because we became an urbanized people. We became a people who said, okay, prayer replaces sacrifice. And so instead of having agricultural sacrifice be like the way of showing devotion to our people, now it was, okay, you have to be literate and be able to show up to the Beit Midrash, to the house of study, to learn and to read. And that there's this cleaving that happened between those who stuck to the land and those who stuck with the people. And that this position of being a Jewish farmer has been a kind of a difficult like pulling for, at this point, like 2,000 years or more, of having to balance the needs of living a land-based life with the needs of an increasingly urban people whose like mainstream notions of who we are very tied to book learning and very tied to like a dense population of gathering that is difficult in the settings where farming often happens, which are more population less population dense and more rural.
And we have this, we like to say before we were the people of the book, we were the people of the land. That's just kind of what Sarah said in a pocket version,
which is not our phrase, but we use it with abandon.
Well, there's an affinity between all three of those, which is you have the text is both the text in the page. It's also the text on the rows in a farm, right? They describe the letters as little planted seeds on the line, like in a plowed field. And then you have the text as in like weaving, when you have textual, like you have the textual analysis, but you also have textiles, right? That's like the weaving of the animals. So then you have the animals, the plants, and the books.
Do you ever have to weed those beds, or do they stay clean?
What, the books?
I'm just saying, like, it sounds like you never have to weed those beds. They're like perfectly lined.
Yeah, you do, because it's all the misunderstandings. Poor readings of books. And also, you could actually think of the weeds as the commentaries. The Jewish books are set up. You have the field, and then you have all the encroaching commentaries making their way into the field.
Do you think Rashi would enjoy being called a weed?
I think he would.
Persistent.
Rashi actually wrote all of his.
Opportunistic. I said persistent and opportunistic.
Rashi wrote all of his books anonymously. At least that's the legend. So what he would do is he would just distribute his commentaries as anonymous pamphlets. That's why they call them kuntrasim, little pamphlets. And he would just put them into Beis Medrash as like help, but he didn't say who did it. And then eventually they started collecting them and realizing who it was, because he was he had a vineyard. He was a winemaker.
Our beloved housemate and farm mate here, Jesse Schaefer, has a bumper sticker on his car that says a weed is a social construct. And I like to uplift that at any moment, that like our perception of what is a weed is just something that we don't either understand or value where it's growing.
Yeah, it's usually the ones that do really good.
Yeah, because they're growing in their natural environment. So they're suited to where they are, as opposed to lettuce, which is a baby that requires constant tending.
Did you find it, in what ways did you find the dispelling of that myth or the debunking of that myth that Jews are not connected to the land? In what ways did you find a retelling of that story for yourselves? What's your new story?
I mean,
Or the old news story, the Alta news story?
yeah. Well, yeah, it's interesting because like there's this whole thing about Jewish weakness that's like it's like really like it's like an Ashkenazi thing that's like rooted in Nazi era anti-Semitic propaganda about Jews being like swarmy and weak, and I find that retelling of that story in my own strength in what I do with the land. So that's my new narrative, and also in the strength of my mother and my mother's mother. Like, I'm not just talking like emotional strength, because like strangely many of you in this call know my mom. There's a lot of hard strength there, but like also like physically like insanely strong. So that's my retelling.
I think, yeah, I think the retelling of it is happens on a daily basis, and I've talked about the this like intellectually and shared it in teaching spaces, and I think only in the last maybe year or so seen the ways in which like I've internalized this fear and feeling that like, oh, I'm not strong enough to do this work, like I'm not actually like grounded enough in the embodied world to do this work, like that I talk about it more than I do it. And this being our first growing season here at Yesod Farm and Kitchen, which is among many other things the home base of the Jewish Farmer Network, has been like a constant cycle of disproving this to myself while trying to not like hurt my own body in like the name of disproving propaganda that is, you know, over half a century old.
Yes.
So I think the duality of knowing that even if I'm sleeping in that morning, like my persistence in being here and doing this work is a refutal of these narratives, and like I don't have to fight so hard. Like I don't have to fight with the dead. I can just live my life and do it well, and that is enough.
There's also Sarah needs to tell this, but this whole thing with Henry Ford, where you can go for it.
It's a refutation of gender.
Sorry, say that again.
Of who?
Of gender
Oh yeah,
bias also.
100%. 100%. And also, I just like always need to name this, like, because people are like, oh, it's so cute that like so many more women are moving to farming in this moment. I just want to just like name that they have looked into this, and a lot of why there are a lot more women moving towards agriculture than men is that women are more okay with being paid not as well, and farmers are not paid as well. So a lot of women are like, yeah, I'm used to being paid not so well, and like this is normal for me. And men are like, oh, I'm not really down to be paid so little in like a learning position. So I just want to like name that, because sometimes like people tout those numbers, and like it's like also like kind of problematic. So I just wanted to say that.
And I think the layer on top of that also is we have a significant portion of people in our network are gender queer, gender nonconforming, and trans. And that a lot of what we hear from those members of our community is that like the soil doesn't judge them, and that like this kind of embodied work is really healing and really affirming for them when oftentimes like they're in spaces that don't affirm their bodies and don't affirm their presentations in the world, but that the soil doesn't judge them in the same way.
Well, actually, that goes to what you mentioned, Yesod Farm and Kitchen. So we talked about the Jewish Farmer Network and hovered around some of those ideas and its genesis. What about Yesod Farm and kitchen specifically?
What about it?
Well, Yesod Farm, it's a farm, but why and kitchen? That's what I'm. Such a
Yeah,
good.
thank you. So Yesod Farm and Kitchen, the reason we're not just Yesod Farm is that I feel like the kitchen part is part of the completion of the life cycle, that the food comes from the ground in a co-creative act between humans and plants and animals and soil. And the kitchen is the part where we actually get to share and enjoy and experience the fruits of our labors, which are literal fruits. And it's also the place of radical hospitality, which means very different things, I think, for us in the time of Corona than it did beforehand. But the and kitchen part for me and for us is an understanding that, like, the most basic building blocks of community is the collective work of growing food, cooking food, and then sharing that food together. And that being part of that arc, that life cycle of taking food from a seed into our bodies is where relationships are built, both with the soil and with the food and with each other, and everyone who shares in the creation of the food and the cooking of the meal and the eating of the meal and the cleaning of it, and then all over again.
There's like kitchen as community.
Kitchen as community, absolutely. And that's you see that motif in many cultures, that idea of like the hearth, the kitchen as the center of the home. And I feel that in our tradition as well, and I feel that in this space.
And you were also saying about how the interaction with, I don't know what to call it, the natural world, godliness, whatever, is also, it's a place that nurtures community. It's like it accepts you.
Mm-hmm.
So what is Yesod?
Yesod is one of the Sefirot, one of the divine emanations. I describe it as the place, like, where the tree of life, Etz Chaim, meets the earth, like where the energy from above and below come together to form creation. For me, it's an energetic way station. It's a place where, like, all of our hopes and dreams kind of are at their final stage before they come into the physical world and are made manifest.
Yesod is also, I've been learning with Eden Pearlstein about the Sefirot. I don't know if anyone, well, yeah, Pearlstone people know him. But think a lot about Yesod is where the genitals are, and it is like a place of fertility. So for a farm and a place that we want to be growing new fruits, I think that emphasis on like a fertile space is also really beautiful.
Yeah, it's also the line. So it's like the like what Sarah said, the way station, or like the communication line. It's also, if you think about a house, when you say foundation of the house, it's the thing that is inserted into the soil, and it's hidden. You don't see it because it's hidden inside the earth, but it's the foundation that's holding up the house. So it's the foundation.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think in that way, like Yesod and that idea of foundation, it's a source of safety, and it's like a kind of sneaky source of safety. Like, you don't see the part of the foundation that's in the ground, but like that is fundamentally what keeps the house from blowing away. And like my hope for this space is that it's able to like offer folks a way of anchoring into themselves and anchoring into space that is foundational for their futures, and just like opening up access to farm space and to space on land, which particularly in this country, like, is being very privatized and very taken out from the commons. We don't have like a really great sense of the commons in this country. So to have land and be able to honor our tradition as Jews that says that we don't really have private land ownership in a way that's that like our tradition tries to honor the ability for land to be stewarded collectively and communally. So trying to bring that piece of our tradition into a political and economic context that that actually thinks that's pretty revolutionary, to not treat things as just ours, but to turn out resources like land into kind of communal offerings.
Yeah, it's sort of like a practical manifestation of some of the Shemitah ethics and permaculture and that we were talking about in the other sessions. It's like making it real, you know, like actually spending your life dedicated to it. One of the things you mentioned was that you had to rethink some of the, or I don't know, yeah, that's a paraphrase, but something to the effect of like during COVID, you've had to rethink how you relate in the Jewish Farmer Network, like what you can do to support, I guess. So maybe you could talk about that. How has that changed? How have you, or what has the Farmer Network been able to do?
So we just in February at Pearlstone had our inaugural conference, which was sold out, and it was beautiful and amazing. And since coronavirus, the wave kind of crashed, we've been feeling supremely lucky that we were able to gather before everything got shut down. And not just because, you know,
I got married the week right before, so it was like, no, boom, and then no more parties ever again. No.
That's Michelle.
Yeah, but so feeling really, yeah, lucky that we got together, because it would have been a huge bummer if all of our hard work was for nothing, but also because in a time of like supreme isolation, it's really like the farmers that were at the conference have cited how grateful they are to have made those connections before going into quarantine. You know, the network primarily exists, I say, in the ether, because it exists like on the internet mostly, except for this one time a year when we gather together. So with all of this like proliferation of like online stuff, it has kind of like eased us into what will actually be a lot of our norm throughout much of the year, is creating online community, and has given like lent itself to like opportunities for gathering people online. So we've had our Jews in Land class, we've had monthly community calls, which are really sweet, where people get to check in with each other. And these are people that like met, they spent 4 days together at Pearlstone in February, and now they're like spread across the country and doing their own thing and having their own struggles as farmers, as gardeners, as homesteaders, as farm-based educators, wherever they're at. And they're so excited to be able to check in with each other and to be like, hey, like, how are things like where you are? Because like things are different everywhere, even, you know, though they shouldn't be. But there's also, so like that's really beautiful. And we're also starting this new initiative called Seed Pods, where people can like opt into this like community of practice that's like centered around a specific theme. So that's something that you know, lending to people feeling like they have a network, feeling like they have a community to support them during this trying and confusing time.
What is the future for the Jewish Farmer Network? Do you have a broader vision? Oops. Are they still here?
Oh no, have they frozen?
It was that intimidating of a question.
Shehechianu.
Yeah. Welcome back.
So what do you guys think is the future of the Jewish Farmer Network?
decide the future of the Jewish Farmer Network.
Yeah.
You can let them know when they come back in.
Yeah.
I moved to Israel to live on a kibbutz in 1971 and fell in love with the land and working the land. It was very, very hard and hot, but I've always been in love with the earth and watching things grow from it. And I love what she said about the nutrient density of food when you grow it yourself. There's something so circular about going out in your yard and picking your beets and cleaning them up and cooking them and eating it, and about food security also. I think that's really, really important, especially right now.
It's so human too, you know, like you feel when you're doing it, it's not just about connecting with nature, you outside of humanity, it's a very human thing to do, and you can feel that connection between your humanity and nature.
Uh-huh.
I do.
Yeah, I do too.
Like, oh, this is right. This feels good.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting that she was talking about your generation being the first ones to feel this connection to the earth. But I came out of UC Santa Cruz in 1971, and there was a lot of that.
Yeah. Did someone want to share?
I mean, I was actually going to ask a question about that because I know the kibbutz movement. Oh, here they are. The kibbutz movement was a huge example of Jews farming, and there must be some connection there. But I think I don't know. Was your experience at Santa Cruz in Jewish community? Were there people excited about land-based living or connections?
Well, we had an organic garden. This is 1970 and 1971, and there was a man named Alan Chadwick who came from England who was a professor. And so there was the whole philosophy around the earth and around working with the earth. And when I went to kibbutz, what I also experienced was this egalitarianism of women on tractors, pregnant, who were out there working the land and who were liberated from the traditional roles of women as being these, delicate little things who could only cook.
Sounds like a beautiful community.
Well, I think the ideal has been, I don't know if it's been reborn or if it's been continually vital, but that was the ideal, is to get away from traditional roles, traditional sexual roles.
Right.
Yeah. It was quite inspiring.
They're back.
I wanted to share, you were mentioning that women nowadays sees himself like leading the farming because of, I said, a salary thing and maybe more stuff. And then you started to talk about Yesod and subtle energies from Kabbalah. And I was just thinking that also in the way which our society works today, sometimes men are socialized to bring their strength from muscles, and which is actually working like this, and with the earth, it's actually break your body way faster. And it seems that the way that actually human have wisdom with their body give them also an advantage in the current situation. So I found it through my journey of liberating my tension in the work. So I thought it's interesting too.
Sarah and Shani, while you were gone, we were talking about Um, that same myth, if I can restate it correctly, I'll let me know if I do it a disservice. But the same myth of Jews are not connected to land, um, we might have gave the impression that this generation Jews are connecting as opposed to last generation, and the example is that the entirety of the kibbutz movement was very returned back to the land, and actually if you go back to um, all those roles for Jewish people are not that story is not even true. We never we never separated from growing our own food. It's not, no one was living in apartment buildings like we were now. There was, I wonder if you could talk about that on a, I'll try to, it's such a large story, try to give it a parameter on a US based level. Like, is the Jewish Farmer Network new? Were there Jewish farmer networks before the Jewish Farmer Network? Was there?
Sorry, this is such a leading question.
Would you like us to talk about the Jewish Agricultural Society?
It seems like you want us to talk about the Jewish Agricultural Society.
Pop every one of those myths. You can show us that we weren't just around money lending in Poland and
I'm gonna go get a prop.
She needs to get a prop from our bookshelf. A different prop from a different bookshelf. So I can continue. So I think it's important to note that the mythology around Jewish disconnection to land is a political tool. And that casting Jews as a professional people, and oftentimes a wealthy professional people, is a tool of white supremacy and a tool of casting Jews as an other that can be blamed for social ills. And I think in a lot of ways, like, our lived experience as Jewish farmers is a visible, embodied refutation of those stereotypes that Jews are only one thing, or that farmers are only one thing. You talked about Henry Ford earlier. Henry Ford was a noted anti-Semite in addition to a car manufacturer, and put out a call in a newspaper that he owned called the Dearborn Independent in the early, like the 20s. I want to say the 20s, early 20s, giving $1,000 reward, which at the time was a tremendous amount of money and still is a lot of money, for anyone who could find him a Jewish farmer, as a way to deepen, to like double down on this myth that Jews don't farm. In reality, at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, there was an organization called the Jewish Agricultural Society that was responsible for resettling, I think, about over 10,000 Jewish individuals primarily from coastal cities on the East Coast to the interior of the United States, and helping them find land and training and jobs as farmers.
So he set up Jewish agricultural communities in both North and South America.
So he being Baron de Hirsch was a European Jewish philanthropist who believed that Jewish safety and Jewish sovereignty was only possible when we were growing our own food. And part of his vision of enacting that was to fund efforts to connect Jews to land and to the skills and resources that were required for Jews to be on land. So,
and I brought a prop. The Jewish Agricultural Society had a publication called The Jewish Farmer. And this is an issue from February of 1958. And this publication, if you open it from this side, it reads in English. And if you open it from this side, it reads in Yiddish. So there was enough of a population of Jewish farmers in this country to warrant a Jewish Farmer magazine in English and Yiddish, which is crazy. I also recently got another one. I've been trolling eBay for them. They're very exciting to me. But it's just like this amazing.
The new one to come out.
You're waiting for the new one to come out?
No, you're waiting for the
We recently as an organization, Shani started having us have a newsletter. And we now have a monthly newsletter that is online. But potentially we are picking up a thread that was dropped in the late 50s to now have a publication that is giving tips, tricks, and tools to people who are living embodiments of the intersection of Judaism and agriculture, primarily but not exclusively in the United States.
So there's a question in the chat that says, expands on just that point. Claire is asking, what kinds of skill sharing and knowledge sharing are you doing as a Jewish Farmer Network?
So I'm really big on not reinventing the wheel. And I find that practical farm skills, there are a lot of other amazingly well prepared programs for learning practical skills for being a farmer, and we are not trying to do that. Our work is in connecting that work to the tradition and heritage of the Jewish people. And also in that, we are not trying to reinvent the wheel. And so the work that we do is in raising up voices of folks in our communities that are already well-versed in teaching this subject matter, and raising up new voices and young voices in these communities to raise up stories that were not otherwise being told, and sharing that information. And to help strengthen that connection. Because for a lot of the farmers that we engage with, they don't even want to be called Jewish farmers. They're like, oh, I'm not a Jewish farmer, like I'm a farmer and I happen to be Jewish. Because their notion of what it is to be Jewish is so far disconnected from their understanding of what it is to be a farmer. And because when they go home to their home communities and they say, hey, mom, dad, shul community, synagogue community, like, I'm a farmer now, people are like, oh, Jews don't do that. What are you doing? That's not us. And so they're like, okay, like Judaism, like the Jewish community, like they don't really accept me. I'm going to just like step away from that and like, just push down that part of my identity. So we're trying to bridge that gap and using the voices that already exist in our community to help build that connection of like shared values. And in terms of, so most of our work, I just want to say, is community building. It's not necessarily skill sharing, because we're not the ones teaching people how to farm. We are teaching them how to integrate or not teaching them how to, but giving them the tools and the resources for integrating their vocation and tradition, and giving them ways to learn about Jewish wisdom, and hopefully building a movement of people that are mobilizing this wisdom to help build a more just and regenerative food system for all. And I've been rambling and I don't remember what the original question is, but I just wanted to respond to something that was in the chat that Yael brought up about, I think Yael's not even here anymore. Yael said that Jews weren't allowed to own land historically. And that's a narrative that a lot of us hold, and is actually like a fairly Ashkenormative notion, because whereas a lot of Jewish folks that come from Eastern Europe were not allowed to own land in a lot of places, those in places like Morocco farmed peacefully alongside their Arab neighbors for 2,000 years. So there's like a lot of different narratives that we need to like bring out in this notion of like who was and was not allowed to own land.
Yeah, I would actually add to that, even the Ashkenazim,
Yeah.
that narrative is not really a normal. We're talking about some court Jews and some other people that were really in that lifestyle that is sort of like this. That's what Ashkenazim were. But like, for instance, I know some people, Georgian Jews, right? We're talking about living in this place for like, in almost like Eli Ragosa said in the previous session, almost Neolithic era life. And many the mountain Jews that were completely like, as if living untouched by time. And even like my family, the part of my family, the Durans, who were in Courland, the part of Latvia, they had an inn and they had an orchard and they made cider and they grew things. And it's just when you start picking that story apart, it's just, oh, okay. They didn't have vast tracts of land where they were, farmers of miles and miles and miles, but growing things and farming was part of many of our lives, even the Ashkenazim. I just want to.
Yeah. So I did a little shout out because I'm one of my great grandfathers. My mother's on the call. One of her grandfathers is was a mountain Jew from Georgia who came to the United States by walking over the Caucasus Mountains with two of his siblings.
I thought you were giving a shout out because we're mountain Jews.
We are also mountain Jews, and we're in the Southern Appalachian Mountains, and I think like the thread that I feel in everything that you just shared, Psaka, is that it's not that Jews haven't been farmers, not that Jews couldn't own land. It's that we're not telling, mainstream Judaism is not telling the stories of our connection to land and of our connection to our food and to farming. We are not uplifting those parts of our community and our narrative and our histories. And in the absence of those stories, the people who choose to farm feel like failures and aberrations in the Jewish community. And I think a big part of our work with the Jewish Farmer Network is to say, like, you are not an aberration of the Jewish tradition. You are an affirmation of our tradition as a Jewish farmer in doing this work. You are not cut off from like the long current of Jewish history. You are very much one of its strands that is, while like frayed, not pretty much unbroken. Like everywhere we've lived throughout all of our time, there have been people who have been Jewish and engaged with the process of feeding ourselves and feeding our neighbors and feeding those who struggle perhaps to feed themselves. And that is very deeply Jewish.
Yeah, something that we started our conference with is that, like, standing in a room full of like 160 Jewish farmers and farm allies, is that like you are like the living legacy of the Jewish people as a people of the land. And that like with like that this legacy lives on through you, and that like that's not something that like ended for the Jewish people when we left.
That is, I really resonate with that, especially at one time a friend of mine taught me, someone was in the room and they said Judaism is a disembodied practice. It's all talking. And the person was like, wait a second. And he just started listing all of these embodied practices. And then he said, and let's just open up the Gemara. Let's open up the halacha. Let's open up this stuff. What is it talking about? Is it talking about disembodied concepts, or is it talking about bodies and farming and seeds? And the person was like, oh yeah, not only is there tons of embodied, but literally it can't stop talking about the body. So it even when it's intellectual, it's very earth-based. Sarah?
I had an experience like that.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, Shani, to say that we have come to our hour. And for those watching here, engaging with us here and on Facebook, we are going to open this space for a little bit longer. But for people who are curious about where they can learn more about what you're doing and how to get involved.
So you can join our mailing list, go on our website,
which is jewishfarmernetwork.org.
Farmer singular. There is not an S.
Or
Jewish,
an ING.
Yep, not Jewish farming, not Jewish farmers, Jewish Farmer Network. .org. And if you want to, hey, thanks, Josh Weinstein. Thank you. And if you go on our website, you can click. You can look at the beautiful faces of all of the farmers in our network. And you can also click the What's On page at the top to find out what opportunities there are for learning and engaging with our community. If you identify as a Jewish farmer, and again, earlier we spoke about what that means, we have a Facebook group that has some questions if you want to be part of the group. If you don't answer the questions, I won't let you in. It's not if you don't answer them properly, it's just if you don't answer them. And then one of our proudest projects is actually our Instagram feed, which is a celebration of the faces and the stories of Jewish farmers. So something that we talked about early in this conversation was about having elders in this community, having Jewish farming role models. It's like that's something that a lot of us grew up with. Like I didn't know anybody growing up that was Jewish and farming. And so we try to like capture the notion of if you can see it, you can be it. So you can go on there and find someone who is Jewish and farming just like you. And maybe find Jewish farmers in your area and just get to learn a lot. And that's Jewish Farmer Network on Instagram, same Jewish Farmer Network on Facebook. And that is how you can stay connected.
So one of the things that, thank you so much, Shani. And Sarah. Shani is my best friend, and
It's me.
so glad that you're on here talking. One of the things that's been mentioned a lot during this conversation is narratives. And one of the things that I thought was so powerful and beautiful during the network gathering was that along the wall of the gathering room where we met for all of our like big spaces during the conference, you posted up a timeline of like Jewish farming through the ages, of like starting to compile and collect all of those narratives that sort of like link together Jewish farmers across time and space. And I'm curious what is happening with that project and like how you see yourselves, how the network sees itself, like being a resource for like putting that narrative out there and inviting people to engage with it. And there are some questions in the chat after that.
So just to respond to your question, Sarah, I am currently looking for a computer person who knows how to take that time. This is me on the computer because I'm a farmer. I don't know how to do this, but looking for a computer person who knows how to take that timeline and make it into like an interactive thing on our website. And that would be something, and like that would include like a form that people can like put submissions on, like, hey, I have this piece of Jewish agricultural history that I think should be on this timeline, and be able to add it in and have it be something with like pictures and stories and sources and like all of these different things. So that's something that we're working on making accessible on our website. So all of y'all out on the internet, if you know how to do that, reach out.
And I think the other piece of that is this Jews and Land study group that just concluded our first run. And like shout out to Alex Moynow, our facilitator, and then the Jewish Farm School where that course was first run. So wanting to share with Jewish farmers and Jewish farm related folks the histories of Jewish relationship to land through time and space. And so we're excited to have that offering come through for the first time for this past month, and looking forward to opening up that offering again in a couple weeks.
And if you are interested in being part of that class, there are multiple parts, but if you're interested in being part of it, you can also go on our website to the What's On page and join the wait list for the Jews and Land class.
Awesome. So a little while back, Josh asked the question, what happened to the Jewish Agricultural Society, and are there any remnants you've found, or folks who have memories and or were part of that link chain, going back to the Jewish Agricultural Society?
New Jersey.
Yeah.
So we've several people in our network who are the descendants, either the children or the grandchildren or even the great-grandchildren of people who were put on land and made connections as farmers through the Agricultural Society. So like that, those histories are still very much alive in our community. And it's really beautiful to see the ways in which, you know, some people have stayed with the land and some people have not.
Most have not.
Most have not, which is the story beyond the like Jewish American farmers. That's the story of American farm families. And in as industrial agriculture made it almost economically impossible to survive and thrive as a small family farm in the United States throughout the post-World War II era. A lot of those farms went away, and a lot of the agencies and organizations serving those farming populations also went away because their constituency was squeezed out of the market. So as far as we can tell, the Jewish Agricultural Society went defunct in the early 60s as small farm families, Jewish and not Jewish, were forced to sell their land and to pick up other ways of supporting themselves.
And I think the archives are in Buenos Aires, Argentina.
I think there's some in Cleveland too.
Apparently there's some in Cleveland too.
When we can travel again, I would love to find a research trend and go do an archive dig.
Yeah. Someone flew in Yiddish and Spanish. Again, hit us up.
Also, I love that Sarah Robin's jump screens.
From one to the other.
I actually do know someone who did a research project in Argentina and speaks Spanish and Yiddish that just finished their PhD about Yiddish theater. So they might.
Yeah. If y'all know folks who know where these histories are or have access to research databases, we are really interested in expanding our knowledge and our ability to share that knowledge with our network.
Also, thanks for the pro tip, Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, the New York Public Library System has a big collection of Jewish farmer periodicals. Who knew?
And the Baron de Hirsch Fund is actually still in existence.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Mike Tabor, who's one of our Jewish farmer elders, he reached out to them in the 70s, and they supported him and his community in establishing what's now Licking Creek Bend Farm in Needmore, Pennsylvania. So we know as recently as the 70s, they were still doing something, at least.
Stories.
Forever.
Do we have I have another question. So, when you started out, I'm assuming that that you didn't know you were going to arrive at this sitting in front of that bookcase and talking to people about Jewish farming. So I have two questions. You don't have to recount the whole journey to this exact moment where you're sitting in front of the bookcases, but what do you wish you had known before you started out? Something you learned along the way and wish you had known.
Wow. I think I wish I had known that this was going to become my whole life. Didn't see that one coming.
What would you have done differently?
Probably nothing. Actually, I don't know. I maybe would have left my job at Pearlstone earlier and done some other things before this. I love Pearlstone. I also love my free time.
What about you, Sarah?
I did not get into farming to start a nonprofit. Neither of us got into farming knowing that we were going to be spending a large swath of our time on the computer. And I don't think maybe the veil of ignorance was helpful perhaps to not know what doing this work was going to require, but perhaps I wish I would have known not just what kind of work I was signing up for in that moment of sitting on a couch at Isabella Friedman making a Facebook group with Shani, but to be reminded, as I often am, that the work that we are doing, while it takes me away and takes us both away from the physical labor of farming that we both really love, that it is valuable and valued by our community, that we are constantly affirmed in our work from people saying I felt really alone and I felt like I was the only one, and now I know that I'm not. And I think particularly in a time of such severe social isolation, like we all can empathize and understand a little bit more how scary it can be to feel alone and to feel like the only one. And that when we realize that we are actually deeply connected to other people, to like a long strand of tradition that can hold us in our discomfort and can hold us in our uncertainty, that is comforting and life-giving, and that brings meaning to our work. So I think
Makes it worth it.
makes it worth it. It makes it worth it. So I think we're all right, but I think that knowing that what the kind of work that we were signing up for in that moment, and that and also knowing that how it was going to be valued and valuable to our community would have been nice. I would have kept better order of my email.
Me too.
And I think my follow-up question to that, and it probably has to do with what you just said, is what was the thing? Because I remember, what was the thing that you were right about, and that not everyone could see it?
We were right that there were a lot of Jewish farmers who happened to be Jewish, out in the world that were feeling really alone and that were hungry for connection.
Yeah,
we were right.
You were right.
Way to go.
Thank God you were. So going off of what we were just talking, or what you were just talking about, to what extent is the network self-organizing? And like, if it's not yet, are there plans in the works for that to happen, or is that just not even a goal?
What do you mean when you say that, self-organizing?
Like, are people, beyond the seed pods, like reaching out to each other in groups and organizing place-based meetups, or, I mean, not during this time, but like, is that kind of chatter going on?
So we were hoping for a lot of place-based meetups this year. We were going to be launching an initiative to have like farmer Shabbat dinners at regional farm conferences throughout the country, which would allow for farmers in a given region to build connections with each other at a place where they're already gathered together. And that's obviously not happening. I think that for the farmers that came to the conference, there's a lot of like synthesis and a lot of like mycelial action in the network, where people are really connecting with each other and like reaching out to each other for recommendations and for like advice and support. And we hope that will just continue to grow. And what's really exciting about the seed pods is that they are like, we're not running those. Members of our community who are taking initiative and like who are committed and excited to be continuing these conversations are co-convening these groups. And like they're doing the outreach and they're doing the like all of these things, and it's like amazing to see the momentum that we got going with the conference continue despite coronavirus. It's still going on, and it's really special to see that happening. But hopefully regional meetup groups 2021.
But I think the beauty of the network, just to add to that, the beauty of the network is that from the beginning, it has been very much about people meeting each other and meeting each other's needs. So like I walked into a gathering, not our gathering, a different gathering, and met a Jewish farmer in our network who said that they had talked to someone else they'd met through our Facebook group for several hours on the phone. And as a result, they had been able to treat their goat, and their goat survived because of advice they got from another Jewish farmer that they connected with via our online platform.
Across the country,
totally different regions. We have Jewish farmers who are in their 70s who are meeting other Jewish farmers in their age cohort and like building friendships that are starting online and moving out into the real world. And they're like, driving to see each other. And people who have felt
not now.
People were people, people who felt like they were the last Jewish farmer in Connecticut, like having conversations and real life friendships with other people who are Jewish and farming, not that far from them. And so in that way, like we've always been a self-organizing network of people who are asking for what they need and sharing what they can offer, and finding people who are deeply receptive and hungry for those things.
Sarah and Shani, we're getting close to our half an hour Q&A mark. And I wanted to, it's like, when you want people to binge watch things, then you put like a cliffhanger in the end. So in order to spur on another conversation that we could have, because this will probably open up it's definitely a much larger conversation. But since you talked about community, I'm wondering, as like the central motivating hub of this, both in the kitchen and just the network itself, what is and when we're talking about Jewish farming and the connection to the land, what is the relationship with the indigenous tribes here in particular, and also with the indigeneity and Jewish farming? Like, what are your, and I think that's a whole nother conversation, with its own Q&A afterwards, and a nice long conversation about that. But what I think it's good for people to hear.
Yeah. So I think, so I was asked that recently by a reporter, and like what I feel like that's the central, one of the central questions of our work is like, what does it mean to be an indigenous people of a land-based tradition, practicing our land-based tradition on land that is someone else's indigenous homeland, and like how to do so with honor and like respect for those that stewarded this land before us, and just like what it looks like to be in conversation with these ecosystems, which are not the ecosystems that birthed the Jewish tradition. So we had a lot of conversations about that at the network gathering, at the Cultivating Culture, our first conference. And I think that we're just going to continue having that conversation, and not conversation for the sake of finding an answer, but just like to be like, this is one of the central questions, I think, of our work, but like also specifically of like being a Jewish farmer. Like that is, for me, the central question. So that's just something that I sit with all the time. And I think that we're always seeking ways to do this work with the most possible respect and honor given to those who stewarded this land before us. And yeah, so that's fine.
Is it like you're in community?
In community. So I mean, Sarah wants to share about this land specifically.
Yeah, I mean, the network, the Jewish Farmer Network, is mycelial, but the ethos is foundation. It's inside of the earth.
Yeah.
And
So
it's in a place. So how does that relate?
So we're calling in from ancestral Cherokee and Catawba land, and we, on our wall, we have the Radical Jewish Calendar, which I highly recommend. It's a great calendar, and it marked a couple days ago as the yard site. I'm going to do some cultural mixing here, but the yard site of the beginning of the Trail of Tears. So we are on land of a people who were forcibly, violently removed from their land by the United States government and its soldiers. And as a member of people who have been repeatedly displaced throughout history, like I feel like a deep, deep pain at being on this land. And I have a hard time bonding with this land and tending to it as a steward with that knowledge that like I am here as a result of genocide. I'm here in a legacy of a tremendous amount of pain and violence. And I'm trying to, at every moment, translate my cultural context and my people's calendar and our sense of time and rhythm and connection to the natural world from a place that that is not this place. While there are people, a little bit further west of here in Cherokee County, and also thousands of miles from here in Oklahoma, who are practicing their traditions in various forms of diaspora as well. And I think here at Yosef Farm and Kitchen, we wrestle with this through acknowledgement and through learning. We're kind of the Cherokee and Native American section of our libraries right behind my head. Through financial distributions to the Cherokee people and various entities of redistributing some of the resources that we have access to here to those people so that they can continue to find ways to thrive in hardship and in diaspora. And through like very, very long process of building relationships with Indigenous peoples and with Cherokee peoples, so that this land is not held by Jewish stewards to the exclusion of Cherokee access, but can be, so we can be a part of a healing process through this land, and not just holding it for ourselves and saying we get to do our cultural healing work here, but exploring how this work in this place can be returned to Indigenous stewardship through time and through relationship building. And I'm grateful to have the tools of our culture to kind of guide us through that process. One of those tools is tithing, is that, you know, we have an understanding that 10% of our harvest isn't ours. 10 to 20% of our harvest isn't ours. It belongs to the vulnerable, belongs to those people who don't have an ability to produce their own food. And we implement tithing in our financial structure here with an eye towards redistributing that tithe towards Indigenous peoples of this land. We also have tools like Yovel, which says that land should be held in communal stewardship, and that every 50 years, after 49 years, after 7 cycles of Shemitah, and there have been other classes on Shemitah earlier today, that land should be returned to its ancestral stewardship, ancestral communal stewardship, and that everyone should have an opportunity to return to their home place. So part of the project of this place is exploring what does it actually mean to have a place be seeking Yovel, not on our land, not in like the place of our calendars founding, but here as Jewish stewards of Cherokee and Catawba land in 2020.
Thank you.
That's a question.
I really couldn't add to that. I would just say that both of you, I can't imagine two more subtle intellects and hard workers to actually put some of this stuff into action and wrestle with all of this really deep ideas and healing actions. I think that that's like farm and kitchen. So thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Pasachia.
Thank you for being a teacher to both of us.